Welcome, everyone. I'm Pavandeep Sandhu, and I am the mental health counselor here at Evergreen Valley College Student Health and Wellness Services. This is the Anxiety Toolbox. I hope everyone joined the right workshop. Great. So, this is a workshop series for people who experience anxiety. Did anyone feel anxious before signing in today? Or if you're feeling anxious now? So maybe many of us, that's normal and it's going to be expected. So good for you for signing in anyways. Actually, exposure to anxiety provoking situations like attending a workshop, even though you're feeling anxious, is a major tool in managing anxiety. We'll talk more about this later, but for now, great job. Hopefully, as we move forward in the workshops, you will find your anxiety decreasing. So I want to start off with touching on confidentiality. So as a reminder, confidentiality is limited when the risk of suicide or homicide, suspicion of abuse of a child, adult over 65, or dependent adult abuse, or when there is a legal valid request for mental health records. As this is a group setting, there's no way to guarantee confidentiality. However, our expectation is that no information about anyone in the group will be shared, including other stories, even if you think that no one will know whom you're speaking about. We want to ensure that it feels safe to speak aloud or share thoughts or comments within this workshop. So just a few quick reminders. This group is designed so that you are not required to share what brought you into counseling or anything else you don't want to share. Keep in mind that the more you participate, the more you're going to get out of this workshop. So since this format is a little bit different, we will be jumping right into the Anxiety Toolbox. So you can follow along in the student workbook, and that is found on the EVC website, linked here below. That is an important part of this workshop. So what I'm going to do is just give you an intro to this toolbox, this workshop, and what to expect. Let's start by me giving that brief summary about what this is and what you can expect while attending these workshops. So, as many of you read in your workbook, there are 3 60-minute sessions for Anxiety Toolbox, including today. So, in order to get the most from this workshop, I'm going to ask that you have your workbook with you at all sessions. If you forget it, please click on the link on the previous slide, have it open. If you want a physical copy, please stop by our office and we can provide you with that. Because the onset of anxiety can vary from person to person, this workshop series is not necessarily going to focus on identifying the cause of your specific individual experience. So instead, this workshop will focus on better understanding anxiety symptoms and on building skills to cope with anxiety. The 3 workshops are divided into content that build on itself. So today in session 1, we take a broad look at 4 symptom clusters of anxiety and introduce a method of slowing down and disentangling that experience of anxiety. In session 2, we focus on increasing insight on the thought patterns that impact anxiety, increasing awareness, and understanding are the major tools in addressing anxiety. In session 3, we develop alternative responses to anxiety. And each of you are going to be creating a personalized action plan for managing anxiety. There are in-session exercises in which you will pause the video at that time, write things down, reflect, and there are homework assignments. The assignments are for you and only you. You're not going to be required to provide your responses. Send them to me, share them out loud at any time. I do ask that you write your responses in your workbook because many of the in-session exercises where you're going to pause the video, they really build on each other. And to complete some of the written worksheets, you're going to be asked to look back and elaborate on a prior assignment from time to time. So this workshop provides a lot of information in a very short period of time. At times you may feel overwhelmed by all of the information, and that is okay. Remember, the workshop is yours to take with you, and you are very strongly encouraged to review the materials between sessions. In order to build coping skills, regular practice is essential. The more that you practice, the more you're going to get out of this. Remember, there's 168 hours in a week, and we only spend one of those hours in this Anxiety Toolbox series. There are 167 more hours in the week, and I hope that you'll use some of that time to practice these skills. And if you don't complete homework assignments, please still come to the workshop anyways. So that's a very basic summary of what these workshops are about. So today's agenda, what we are going to be looking at is we're going to be talking about the difference between stress and anxiety and how stress can actually be a good thing. We will talk about what anxiety is, what's happening in your body when you are anxious, talk about symptoms of anxiety and how they interact, practice a breathing exercise to help manage your anxiety symptoms. So before we dive in, let me highlight that in your workbook, the student workbook, you'll find information sheets on what we talk about throughout the workshop series. So feel free to take notes on those worksheets if you want to, but no pressure, it's not required. So let's talk a little bit about what is the difference between stress and anxiety. So oftentimes we use the term stress and anxiety interchangeably, and they are actually different when it comes to diagnosable anxiety disorders. Think about the difference between an everyday anxiety or stress and an anxiety disorder. So clinical anxiety and everyday anxiety or stress often look similar and share the same arousal response. Arousal basically means being alert physically and mentally. So both anxiety and stress trigger people to become more alert. They also share many of the same symptoms. So here's ways we can distinguish between the two. Stress or everyday anxiety, we have the idea of it's a response to a known environmental factor or a stressor. Symptoms usually go away when the stressor goes away. It's something we all experience at some point in our lives, and it can be motivational. Sometimes a stressor can be ongoing, chronic, or overwhelming that can lead to clinical anxiety. And with clinical anxiety, we are seeing that it can occur with chronic stress, a major stressful event, or when there is no identifiable stressor. Symptoms persist after the stressor has passed. Symptom intensity is exaggerated compared to what it would be in a particular situation. It causes significant distress and interferes with your daily life. It generally is not motivational. It is perpetuated by avoidance, which we will be discussing later. And anxiety can take many forms and may or may not be diagnosable. Maybe think of an example of the difference between an everyday stressor and a major stressful event. So anxiety ranges in severity from everyday anxiety or stress to a diagnosable anxiety disorder. For a list of differences between stress and clinical anxiety, and for more information about various diagnoses, I encourage you to take some time after or between sessions, looking at pages 39 and 40 of the appendix. So for now, I want to highlight the part about stress or everyday anxiety as a motivator and high levels of anxiety as a hindrance to our performance. So please turn to page 7 of your workbook for a visual of the Yerkes-Dodson model of arousal and performance. The idea here is that someone who has no stress or anxiety, no arousal, has little motivation to perform and keep up with their responsibilities. On the other hand, someone with too much anxiety or arousal may attempt to avoid a situation or may perform poorly due to their symptoms. However, with a moderate level of arousal from stress or anxiety, a person is likely to be motivated to prepare, concentrate, and do whatever is necessary in the situation without becoming debilitated or avoidant. So, for example, some stress before a test or a deadline may motivate and energize you to study. However, with minimal or no stress, you may say, why bother studying? And decide to just, I'll wing it. With too much anxiety, you may feel overwhelmed and hopeless and avoid studying at all. Also, when you are taking the test, too little stress can result in a lack of focus and effort, whereas too much stress can make it difficult to recall the information or cause you to get fixated on specific questions or a section. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Does it make sense? So what happens when we avoid situations that trigger anxiety? So let's talk about avoidance, which is the common response to feelings of anxiety. So if you take a look at the graph on page 7 to help visualize how avoidance relates to anxiety, you will see that often when people are in an anxiety-provoking situation, they experience numerous uncomfortable physical, emotional, and cognitive symptoms. So, in an effort to avoid the uncomfortable experience of anxiety, people avoid the anxiety-provoking situation altogether. For example, some people who sign up for this workshop avoid the anxiety triggered by starting the workshop by not coming at all. So initially, the avoidance brings a sense of relief. However, every time that we avoid an anxiety-producing situation, our anxiety is reinforced. The brain sees it like this. When I avoid this situation, I feel better, or at least nothing bad happened. I guess I should try to avoid it next time too. The avoidance anxiety roller coaster repeats. Does that sound familiar? But the short-term relief of avoidance and escape comes from a high cost. So avoidance and escape contribute to basically the persistence of anxiety and reduce the person's level of daily functioning. This is why exposure or building up your ability to do things that you typically avoid because of anxiety is actually beneficial. Gradually exposing yourself to the anxiety-provoking situation can help you to see the situations more realistically and increases your tolerance for anxiety. For example, for those of you who experienced anxiety signing into today's workshop, you will feel likely, I should say, feel less anxious about coming to the next workshop. So we're going to move into the flight, fight, freeze response. So how can we increase exposure and get off of the anxiety avoidance roller coaster? First, we need to understand what's going on for you when we experience anxiety. Let's start by talking about what's going on in your body during anxiety. A big part of anxiety has to do with our physiological responses to stressors. Some of you may have heard the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's what we're going to be talking about here. So essentially, the most primitive part of our brain, our amygdala, has an evolutionary basis in protecting us from danger. This is a very good thing. Our amygdala is our body's anxiety switch. So when we were early humans, we were living in the wilderness and needed protection from dangers such as animals, other predators. This part of our brain adapted and switched on to help us either fight the predator or flee from the situation. Fighting or fleeing, avoidance, was our brain's adaptive response to danger. So researchers later acknowledge that in addition to fighting or fleeing, we may also respond by freezing when we perceive danger. It's not as commonly discussed, but it's also an adaptive response. The freeze response is more of an automatic shutdown in functioning, kind of like a deer caught in headlights. So let's think about this. If you were hiking and you were confronted by a dangerous animal and the amygdala, the anxiety switch, was turned on, what might you feel happening in your body? So let's take a look at the symptoms list. And I want you to put a check mark next to the ones you have experienced. So I'm wondering if any of these seem familiar to you. A lot of people probably seem familiar with some of these things. So these are our flight or fight responses that are triggered by our amygdalas. The response saved us from danger as early humans, and they can save us from danger today. So they're very helpful and adaptive when it comes to life-threatening situations. But typically, the threats we face today that trigger the physiological response are not life-threatening, right? So when was the last time you had to escape from a dangerous animal, right? So what are the anxiety-provoking threats or situations we face today? Think about that and either write it down, think out loud, of naming some threats we face in this day and age. So while you think of those, I might give a few examples, such as tests, social interactions, going on a date, meeting new people. So the threats are different, but our brains are reacting just like they did when we were early humans dealing with life-threatening situations. The fight, flight, or freeze system is getting mistriggered because our brains are not distinguishing between life-threatening and non-life-threatening situations. It's like a false alarm that is constantly going off. Our amygdala gets stuck on the on mode, so we run away from or fight danger all day long. And basically, we are tiring ourselves out. So, further, the amygdala learns that this level of arousal and anxiety, this constant on mode, is the new normal. And what happens is it adapts and adopts this elevated level of anxiety for the body. This may be why some of you feel anxious all the time. So the fight, flight, freeze response is triggered by the amygdala, and it contributes to our physiological symptoms of anxiety. These physiological symptoms are uncomfortable, so we try to avoid them by avoiding anxiety-provoking situations. But there are only components of a greater picture of anxiety. So let's try to get a fuller picture here. As we talk about anxiety, we will be using a specific model called the cognitive behavior therapy model, CBT model. So this model is evidence-based in treating anxiety. The CBT model focuses on interactions between symptoms in three main areas. We have our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When we talk about anxiety, we add physical sensations to this model because, as we discussed, physical sensations are a major part of anxiety experience. So in these three sessions, we're going to really focus on 4 symptom clusters: physical, emotional, behavioral, and our cognitive responses. In your workbook, there is a visual of the model and an example. This diagram, what it does is it illustrates how each of these symptom categories interact with and impact the other. The CBT model is very fundamental part of this anxiety toolbox, and we're going to frequently refer to this diagram throughout these 3 workshop sessions. So at the top of this page, you will fill in a situation, something that's happened, or an occasion which you felt anxious. Please let me know if you have any questions about the CBT model. You can always send me a message. So before completing our own personal CBT model worksheet, it's important to acknowledge that for some of us, this activity, thinking about and writing down our anxiety symptoms, may actually increase our current anxiety. This is totally normal, especially if we are used to avoiding thinking about it. So just know that as we spend time talking about anxiety in a constructive manner, the intensity of the anxious feelings will most likely begin to decrease. And at the same time, we will be practicing new tools to manage our anxiety. So at this time, I'm going to actually get into looking at the blank CBT model diagram. So please pause the video, take a minute to think about a situation where you felt anxious, jot down the symptom of anxiety you personally experienced. If you're having trouble thinking of symptoms, go back to the page 11 or 12 for examples of symptoms. So go ahead and take a few minutes to write these down. Okay, let's talk about this exercise. Were you able to identify specific anxiety-provoking situation and your specific corresponding anxiety response? So just a reminder that we will be asking you to continue to practice these. So it's a good chance to talk through anything that comes up when you are filling out the CBT model worksheet. So we may have just increased our anxiety symptoms by actively focusing on anxiety-provoking situations instead of avoiding them. So let's learn a new skill for our anxiety toolbox. One of the most effective coping strategies you can use for anxiety symptoms, particularly the physical ones, is deep breathing or other relaxation techniques that include deep or focused breathing. I'm curious how many of you have practiced deep breathing or focus on your breath in meditation or yoga. So remember how we talked about the fight, flight, or freeze response just a few slides back? This response activates our sympathetic nervous system. So what's happening is it sends oxygen to our arms and legs, so you're prepared to fight or flee. However, less oxygen is sent to your thinking brain in your prefrontal cortex. So then this makes it very difficult to think clearly. Deep breathing and relaxation, what they do is they activate the other part of your nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. And in turn, that sends a signal to your brain to tell your anxious part that you're safe. You don't need to use the fight, flight, or freeze response. So deep breathing gets more oxygen to that thinking part of the brain. Also, it addresses the physical fight, flight, or freeze symptoms directly. So you are freeing up mental energy to address these symptoms. Before we practice deep breathing, let's take a moment to check in on our anxiety level. This is like a thermometer reading of anxiety. We're going to rate our anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being very low to no anxiety, 10 being the most severe anxiety you've ever experienced. So just jot down your number. So let's learn this new skill of deep breathing. I'm going to guide you through it as a group, and then I want you to pause the video and practice on your own. If it's too uncomfortable to do it right now, try doing it, at another time, maybe while you're laying down. It'll give you a fuller effect. So I'm going to go ahead and explain this to you. I know it sounds simple, but it actually takes a little bit of concentration. So place one hand on your stomach, one on your chest. We want to feel the hand on our stomach, move it in and out more than the one on our chest. We'll take a deep breath in through our nose. As we inhale, we count in our mind 1, 2, 3, 4. And we imagine using the air we breathe in to push against our hand on our stomach. Hold the breath for a count of 2. Then we exhale through our mouth like we're blowing out a candle. Exhale for a count of 1, 2, 3, 4, and pause. and before starting again. Now, let's try it again. Breathing in for a count of 4, holding for a count of 2, and breathing out for a count of 4. Let's try it one more time. Breathing in for a count of 1, 2, 3, 4. Holding for a count of 1, 2. Breathing out for a count of 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I want you to pause the video, take a minute to practice on your own. I realize that breathing out through the mouth can make a little sound, but hopefully you are in a safe place to practice. If you are feeling anxious about making a sound while breathing, I want you to note that this is the opportunity to practice, not avoiding. So we all kind of sound funny at first when we're doing this. So now let's take a new thermometer reading. Please rate your current level of anxiety on the scale from 1, very low to none, to 10, most severe. Did you notice any shift in the numbers? I encourage you to keep practicing this simple, powerful tool. This is something you can continue to practice anywhere since it's relatively quiet and you always need to breathe. So, although we don't really have time to discuss how anxiety can impact our sleep in this workshop series, I do want to acknowledge that people often have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep due to stress, anxiety, and other reasons. So there is a handout on page 13, I believe, in your workbook on sleep hygiene, which means habits for healthier sleep in case you have trouble sleeping and want to try some tips that are listed there. So let's go ahead and talk about, our session summary here. So today was all about slowing down and disentangling the anxiety process. In this workshop today, we talked about the differences between anxiety and stress. We learned that some stress and anxiety can be motivational. We discussed the anxiety avoidance roller coaster and the value of exposure. We talked about fight, flight, or freeze and our physical response to anxiety. We discussed the CBT model for understanding how anxiety works. We practiced deep breathing as one tool for managing our anxiety. And we learned how to complete the CBT model worksheet for disentangling those anxiety experiences. Completing the worksheet in and of itself is an important tool for managing anxiety. Using this tool will help you understand your personal experience. So next week, we're going to talk more about the CBT model. In particular, we're going to focus on identifying and managing our anxious thoughts. Your independent practice between now and next session is to complete one CBT model worksheet. So this is an opportunity to practice exposure. If you feel up to it, choose an activity that you typically would avoid due to anxiety and use that as an example you write about in your worksheet. Otherwise, use an anxiety-provoking situation you experience over the next week or something that happens to you often. Try to complete the worksheet as soon as possible after the event. If you're unable to do it, just jot down some notes on your phone that you can review later to prompt yourself to remember what happened. You have multiple blank copies of the CBT model worksheet So feel free to do more than one over the next week. You might consider filling out at least one a day. That might sound a little bit overwhelming, but the more that you practice, the better you will be at using these tools. Also, remember to practice deep breathing in your daily life. Doing regular deep breathing is helpful, not only when you're feeling anxious, but also in maintaining more of a calmer, clear mind on a day-to-day basis. The more you practice deep breathing when you're not already anxious, the easier it's going to be to use when you are anxious. All right. I will see you next week.